Imagine you've just finished creating a game and it's as close to perfect as it could be when suddenly an evil witch shows up and gives you a choice. She says that she's gonna curse your game and make your player either incredibly overpowered or incredibly underpowered. Assuming you still want your game to be fun somehow, which option would you choose? Take a second to think about it and remember your answer for later. Interestingly enough, both of these choices will cause surprisingly similar problems, but I think there is still a right answer here, and to find it, we need to understand 3 questions. First, what does it mean to be overpowered or underpowered? Second, which is worse? And most importantly, third, why does it seem like some of the best games consistently make the same choice? What does it really mean to be over or underpowered? Well, after a bit of research, I've come to the conclusion that the definitions are, unsurprisingly, extremely fuzzy, but I do have a general idea. Now keep in mind, this is not a perfectly strict definition, but in my experience, it tends to be true most of the time. With that said, my definition is as follows. The more overpowered you are, the less of a game's mechanics you have to interact with to reach whatever the win condition may be. So if your character has 15 different attacks, but every single one of them one-shots every enemy in the game, you only really have to use one. This may make you believe that the opposite, having to interact with all of the game's mechanics, is the definition of being underpowered, but I don't think it is. Take a look at this scale. On one end, we've got overpowered, and here, where you're forced to use all of the game's mechanics, isn't the end, but is actually just the middle. This is where peak gameplay exists. The opposition you face is perfectly designed around the strengths and abilities of your character. If we zoom out a bit more to reveal the other end of this scale, we can see that being underpowered means you lack the necessary tools to overcome the challenges presented to you. Regardless of the mechanics you interact with, very few, if any, will allow you to reach the win condition. So if you're fully overpowered, merely walking into the enemy will defeat them, while if you're fully underpowered, you can throw the entire utility belt at whatever nightmarish fiend stands in your way, and they'll just walk right through it. Now, I think we both know that you can subscribe and support the channel through memberships at any time. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong script. Now, I think we both know that being overpowered and being underpowered come with some problems. In a perfect world, every single game would place you at the center of that scale. But considering dating apps exist, we clearly don't live in a perfect world. This is where we can get into that second question. If you absolutely had to be overpowered or underpowered, which one would be worse? Initially, I believed I knew the answer, but in testing over and underpowered systems in games and pushing these mechanics to their limits, I found a result that, while unexpected, makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider the purpose of games and what these terms actually look like in practice. Let me explain. Here's how we'll do this. We'll take that scale from earlier and gradually move towards the ends until we reach the extremes. In doing this, we can quickly and easily see the benefits and drawbacks here, and why some games might choose one option over the other. As we go through the scale, I want you to keep 3 terms in mind: context, engagement, and feeling. Hold on to these. Not only will you notice them a lot, but they'll be extremely important later. Alright, got all that? Great, let's start with the right side and see what it looks like to be slightly overpowered. You may think otherwise due to its title, but Unicorn Overlord is actually quite a good game, and it's also where we can find our first overpowered example. So this is a strategy game. You move your units on a map and battle other units when you encounter them. These auto battles play out based on your party's composition and the tactics and skills that you've given them. One character in particular, though, is especially strong, and if you've played a video game before, you'll pretty quickly understand why. In fact, when I first looked up this character to see if it was just me or if the combination I made really was that strong, I found this Reddit thread asking a similar question about a different combination using that very same character, and this reply that cleared it up for me. Berengaria is basically the definition of overpowered. Here's how your average battle with this unit will play out. The battle starts. She instantly uses her unique passive to debuff the entire enemy party. She then uses an AoE that can hit up to 3 of the potential 6 enemies at the same time. This attack also stuns for some reason. Assuming the battle doesn't instantly end there, somebody else in your party will attack. Berengaria's second passive will activate, allowing her to attack again. This attack heals her, and if the target is stunned or afflicted with any other status effects at all, it also grants her a third passive use. On the off chance there are enough enemies left for it, she'll drop that same AoE from earlier, but part of that attack that I didn't mention is that if the enemy has any type of affliction, it deals double damage. Do you get why this is one of the best characters in the game, or do I have to keep going? That's not a joke, I can keep going. I think it's obvious why this character fits that definition of overpowered. In a lot of situations in this game, you'll see a problem, think for a moment, and decide to use the exact same plan the 2018 Cavs did. Give your best player the ball and get out of the way. This is the first big drawback of being overpowered or having access to something that is. Strategy falls by the wayside in favor of a near unbeatable super weapon. Yet there are 2 significant reasons the game gets away with having such a powerful character. First, she's not so strong that she can solo an entire map. There are still plenty of situations where strategy is important. In fact, in my favorite map in the game so far, I barely used her at all. There are flyers who are weak to bows, or tanks who are weak to magic, or environmental hazards that certain units can cross faster than Berengaria can. There are countless situations in which you'd be better off using an actual strategy tailored to the specific conditions that you're faced with. The second reason is all about optimization and planning. As I mentioned earlier, you don't send in characters alone. Each one is part of a group that works together. Finding the perfect team composition to make this already powerful character even better can be extremely rewarding, even more so directly because of how strong she is. When you plan correctly and build everything as well as you can, the game will reward you by taking this character from one of the best to practically unstoppable. Ultimately, thanks to the limits on this character's abilities, there's still a reason to interact with the game's other mechanics, and if you do so correctly, you'll reach the win condition with better efficiency and effectiveness than someone who chose to just ignore everything but their most powerful unit. Next, let's see what things look like on the opposite end and what it's like to be slightly underpowered. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a fan of FromSoft games. I've only played 2 of them, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't absolutely love both. Let's start with this one. Perhaps my favorite part of Elden Ring is that you almost get to choose where on the scale you'd like to be. You can create a build strong enough to one-shot every boss, or you can try to fight Radahn with a stick, but these are both relatively rare extremes. I think the average player will likely be somewhere around here, and this leads to one of the main benefits of being underpowered: beating the odds. You see, in this game, you'll constantly be faced with multiple enemies at the same time, enemies that are stronger than you, faster than you, and you've got to be kidding me. Being at a disadvantage like this lends itself to more interaction with the game though. My favorite bosses in Elden Ring weren't the ones I beat in one attempt with the Mimic tier, but the ones that I struggled with, fully understood, and eventually mastered. The key here is that when you're underpowered, you're not necessarily gaining a better understanding of the game and its mechanics because you want to, you're doing it because you almost have to. Beating a boss in Elden Ring feels a bit better than clearing a stage with Berengaria because that victory feels more earned. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, look at how much better Elden Ring is than other games, because it actually makes you work for your victories, because this isn't just an Elden Ring thing. I mean, in another universe, I flipped these examples and talked about how Lion's Claw invalidated other melee builds because of how strong it was, and how Lex forced me to better understand the mechanics of the game and strategize more. Being underpowered as a whole makes games harder and more rewarding to complete. And while that challenging win brings satisfaction and forces you to interact with the game's mechanics at a higher level, it's far from perfect. There were plenty of bosses in Elden Ring's late game that were just miserable to me. That higher level of difficulty magnifies a lot of the problems. An attack feeling nearly undodgeable doesn't matter when it only does 10% of your health, but when that same attack will kill you in one hit, it becomes substantially more frustrating to deal with. An even better example of this is something that you might already be thinking of if you've played Monster Hunter: ledges. Having your movement interrupted by a ledge that you didn't see doesn't matter when you're fighting a raptor, but it does when you're fighting a teleporting dragon that can detonate a 3-stage fusion bomb. Regardless, you still get the satisfaction of overcoming that challenge, but the time you must invest to reach that point and the frustration that comes with it may not be worth it anymore. Even so, both of these examples still create excellent experiences. Sure, they have their positives and negatives, but this is what I'd consider the Goldilocks zone. While I'd personally prefer to be slightly underpowered at these stages, I really could go either way. So let's move up a bit and see what things look like on the higher parts of the scale. Tears of the Kingdom is a special game, and in spite of all of its flaws, I loved nearly every second of it. It's also a game that gives you the ability to become quite powerful. With that power, we start to see something pop up in the overpowered side of things that we saw a slight glimpse of earlier: freedom. The more overpowered you become, the more choice you have. In Tears of the Kingdom, this ends up allowing you to use whatever strategy you want once you become powerful enough. You can attach a spring to your shield, use it to launch yourself into the air, rain down bomb arrows from the sky, and just generally fight however you'd like without worrying too much about the consequences. The other neat part about being this strong is the power fantasy. It's something that has a bit of a negative connotation, but it makes a lot of sense. In real life, there are plenty of people who do literally everything right and just don't gain any sort of reward due to bad luck. I mean, just look at YouTube. Videos like this from creators like these are better than practically anything I've ever made, and they've only got 3,000 views. Real life just isn't fair. You don't always win even when you deserve to. But when you're overpowered in a game, you can guarantee that storybook ending. You can work hard and gain your heroic final act where everything plays out the way it's supposed to. Isn't there value in that? Isn't there value in temporarily living in a world where you know your actions and effort will matter? I don't know, maybe that's a video for another time. There are still drawbacks here. In being this strong, you quickly remove any friction from the experience. We're not yet at the point where none of the mechanics matter, but we're getting close. How you use these mechanics doesn't really matter anymore, since everything you do is so strong that you can't really choose the wrong option. If I decide to use my weapon that deals 79 damage instead of the one that does 85, nothing changes. The enemy is dying in one hit either way since they only have 50 health. I could aim for headshots, but why bother? My bow shoots 3 exploding arrows. It doesn't really matter where they hit. In fact, it doesn't really matter if they hit. They explode. If I land a shot in the general vicinity of the enemy, they're probably dead. This leads to an especially noteworthy easy problem, and you'll see what makes it so interesting when we get to the mirrored version of this. Due to the fact that it's basically impossible to lose, I actually ended up avoiding fights because it was kinda boring after a while. I just wanted to cut to the chase and get where I needed to go. Being this overpowered is a lot of fun, especially when it's the culmination of a 100-hour-long adventure, since that strength really does feel earned. But it does create a feeling of complacency where you might not even bother trying anything different because your one strategy of blow everything up is so effective. It's important to remember though, we're not yet at the point where it's impossible to lose. If you really try, and I mean really try, you can still fail here. Now here's where things get really cool. When we head back to the opposite end in Underpowered, we can see two things start to occur. Two things that almost mirror what we saw in Overpowered. Check this out. Octopath Traveler 2 is a turn-based RPG that lets you go anywhere in any order you want. This means that you can artificially create those situations where you're extremely underpowered. I did exactly that and went into this cave with level 40 enemies when I was just level 15, and it was, obviously, incredibly hard. Crucially, however, it also unlocked a new level to the combat that I had never reached in that game prior. So I encountered this frog and it didn't take long to realize just how big that gap between our level and theirs was. Immediately I started considering what my strongest single hit attack was, since I figured that was probably the only thing that would deal high enough damage to get over this thing's defenses. The character who had that attack was Hikari. This meant that the role of every other party member would be to keep Hikari alive, make him stronger, and if it came down to it, stay alive themselves so that there would be a slightly lower chance of Hikari getting targeted. Look, desperate times call for desperate measures, okay? This plan worked brilliantly. Cassie's constant concoctions created cures that ensured we'd survive. The patron Particio passively presented powerful points to the party, and Agnia was kinda helpful too, I guess. When it all came together, the team was like a well-oiled machine, and I as the player felt an immense sense of pride and accomplishment in realizing my only path forward and walking it to near perfection just as the game had requested I do. When we were a bit less underpowered before, we had to interact with the game's mechanics more than when we were overpowered, but here it goes from a strong suggestion to an absolute requirement. When you reach this level, you truly cannot progress unless you're able to use everything at your disposal. One mistake will give you an express trip to the game over screen, and one wrong move or even bad luck might see your most important ally taken out of the fight. The stakes are far higher here, and with those heightened stakes come far more exciting and thrilling encounters. You're way more invested here because you know that you're so weak, every choice you make matters. Yet even still, there exist some serious drawbacks. And this is where we can get into that mirror idea. I ran a poll asking the good people this question of what's worse, being overpowered or underpowered, and an idea that popped up time and time again was that very same thing I mentioned earlier. Being underpowered forces you to interact with the game's mechanics. That's kinda true, but there is a really weird curve that happens here. As you become more overpowered, you can interact with more of a game's mechanics, but you often don't by choice. And as you become more underpowered, you can't interact with as many of the game's mechanics, but you truly understand and engage with the ones that you can out of necessity. In Octopath, Agnia had other skills that she was capable of using outside of Lion Dance and Ruinous Kick, but none of those other skills actually mattered because she was too weak to deal any damage with them. All of them were invalidated in favor of the only strategy that would work. At the very least, I did still have to create a strategy here, and that's important to note since once we reach the end of the scale, well, you'll see. Now remember that problem of avoiding things because fighting when you're that strong is boring? Well, that same problem occurs when you're underpowered. A great example of this are the Lothric Knights in Dark Souls 3. These enemies are so powerful that despite being very beatable, most players won't even bother. They'll just run away because it isn't worth the effort of fighting something that, at the time, is close to the level of a boss. It's the exact same problem, just caused by different things. Keep that idea of mirrored problems in mind, since now it's finally time to take things to their absolute extremes. In Celeste, there's an option called Assist Mode. This grants you invincibility, infinite air dashes, endless stamina, and anything else you may need to make yourself fully and totally overpowered. In fact, Celeste even tells you that this isn't the intended experience and that it's only here for accessibility purposes. With Assist Mode options on, you can create a situation in which failure is not practically impossible, but literally impossible. This is as overpowered as you can be in a game while still having control over your character. The only thing further than this would be the game playing itself, at which point that's just a movie. This is the point where the game's rules and mechanics don't matter anymore. Spikes can't hurt you, you can't fall down bottomless pits, you have no resources to manage, nor do you have to apply any level of precision to your jumps since you'll always make it to where you're trying to land. Believe it or not, this is actually quite similar to what Underpowered looks like. So on this end, we'll look at Breath of the Wild. That may be surprising since this isn't a particularly challenging game, but it does allow you to go straight straight to the endgame content from the start. Now, the game isn't poorly designed. They did plan for this, so there are plenty of safety nets in place, but if we ignore those safety nets, we can get pretty close to what we're looking for. What I did for this demonstration is I cleared the Great Plateau and made a rule to grab absolutely nothing in Hyrule Castle, since having a weapon 36 times stronger than my trusty tree branch feels a little bit silly if the goal is to be underpowered. It's not perfect, but if Celeste's assist mode is the absolute extreme in this direction, I think this is about 95% of that. In this situation, there is almost nothing you can do. None of your weapons are strong enough to deal significant damage to any of the enemies before they break, and once you've broken all of your weapons, you're left with exactly one option: bombs. Technically 1.5 since you can parry certain projectiles if the enemy has any. Now we're faced with a situation where yet again, almost none of your options actually matter. Much like Celeste, the player no longer needs to interact with any of the mechanics in the game since they're so weak that none of these options will have any meaningful impact on the gameplay. Throwing weapons, cooking, stamina, flurry rushes, nothing matters here but bombs and sometimes parries. And this is only if you're playing perfectly, since this early in the game, again assuming we're not using the safety nets, practically every shield you can get is going to break if you miss even one parry. Obviously both of these extremes are incredibly boring, but if you absolutely had to choose one, I think Overpowered would be slightly less miserable since at least that ends quickly. Alright, let's zoom out and take a look at the full scale to see which of these options is better and which is worse. At the earlier points in the scale, I think I'd argue slightly in favor of Underpowered, but as we go further out and as the experience just becomes generally more miserable to endure, I think Overpowered begins to overtake. Here's the key though. Most good games aren't going to fall into either of these two extremes. I mean, even the two examples I just used aren't the normal versions of these games by any means. They both clearly and directly tell you that this is not the intended way to play. I think the majority of games, especially great ones, are only going to use about this much of the scale with the occasional flashes of the extremes for specific moments. And if most great games are somewhere in here, and I've said myself at least twice now that I prefer Underpowered here, then that's it, right? That's why the best games usually choose to make us underpowered. Well, not really. That's not the whole story. There was something I didn't mention during that Breath of the Wild section a minute ago. Years ago, when I first played the game, while I was on my way to Hyrule Castle from the Great Plateau, something significant happened. I was terrified. I recall leaving my horse on the road as I scavenged the ruins in search of anything potentially useful. My eyes were trained on the treasure I might find just as much as they were on the plains nearby, constantly scanning the field, paranoid of any incoming threat, knowing that at any moment I'd have to be ready to drop everything and run. Yet about 100 hours later, I'd returned to that very same area with the scales completely flipped in my favor. In this game, just like in many others, I had gone from being underpowered to overpowered, and it felt great. The context of knowing all the time and effort I put in to get here, the level with which I had to engage with and master the mechanics to obtain this power that I now had, and the distinct feeling of the difference between the start of my journey and where I now stood at the end. All of it came together to cap off one of the best experiences I've had in a video game. The same thing happened in Elden Ring and in Hollow Knight and plenty of other outstanding games that deliberately weaken the player at the start to make them feel helpless and even afraid. Many of the best moments in gaming for me come from when I was overpowered, but only because at one point I was underpowered. I think the reality here is that the best games do make you underpowered, but it's only as a means to an end. It's in moving the player from one side of the scale to the other that the game is able to create a brilliant contrast, one that doesn't just show you how strong you are, but reminds you of all you've had to overcome to get there. This trend of neither option necessarily being the wrong answer is something that we see a ton in games and in art in general, and it's also why you can't really fix certain games. Take a look at this video on that.